At the party venue, for some reason, my husband Stephen and my in-laws ignored me. Other relatives reacted the same way. Suspicious, I pretended to go to the restroom and secretly observed everyone's behavior from the shadows. Then, a terrifying conversation reached my ears. A wife who can't have children is just bad luck. That's right. Talking to such an unlucky person might curse us too. It's better to ignore her. Hearing their words, I was so angry that my body started trembling. Unforgivable. Blaming me for infertility and then ignoring my very existence. I had no choice but to execute my plan immediately. After quietly disappearing from the venue, my phone vibrated. It was, as expected, Stephen calling. "Emily. What have you done?" Stephen shouted in a distressed voice. I chuckled. "What are you panicking about? It's the truth, isn't it?" Stephen seemed half mad because of an image I had displayed on the screen. "But the real retaliation starts now. I'll show them hell from here on. My name is Emily, and I'm 35 years old. 9 years ago, when I was 26, I married Stephen. We met at a matchmaking party. Stephen, 2 years older, was very kind and we hit it off. When we started dating and thinking about marriage, Stephen told me he planned to return to his rural hometown to farm. His village, close to being a depopulated area, was losing people, and he felt a sense of crisis about it declining. I was a bit surprised, but ultimately decided to follow Stephen's passionate plea for me to come with him. Though from a different area, I also came from the countryside. Living in the city was exhausting for me. Fortunately, my brother and his wife lived at my parents' house. Knowing that I wouldn't need to take care of my parents later on also reassured me. Things progressed quickly, and we got married. I quit my job and moved to this small village, Stephen's hometown. However, the village was mostly Stephen's relatives. We lived in a large house that had been Stephen's parents, and they moved to a small house on the adjacent property. They were cheerful and caring, always looking out for us. Though farming was tough, life surrounded by nature wasn't bad. Most importantly, the villagers were all good people. When I said this, Stephen happily remarked, "It's thanks to the guardian." The guardian is a statue in the village square. Statues of the guardian are found all over the village. Some houses even had plush toys modeled after the guardian. This village had a unique custom. The villagers revered the guardian as a literal guardian deity. Stephen said the guardian never overlooks wrongdoing and doesn't forgive bad people. That's why the villagers are all good people. Every old village probably has similar legends. Thinking that way, I didn't pay much attention to it. Our peaceful life continued, and I soon forgot all about it. However, the nightmare was steadily approaching. It was a few years after I married into the family. I had become accustomed to farming. Waking up early every day to quickly harvest vegetables. It's the same routine as always. But there was one thing that bothered me. My husband and I still didn't have any children. I was nearing 30. I had thought it would happen naturally, but recently I had been feeling a bit anxious. This was because, after a few years of marriage, more and more people were asking if we had children yet. Every time, I would cheerfully respond, "It's a gift from above," but in this old farming village, people had no qualms about asking delicate questions. Everyone asked the same thing. Even my in-laws, or sometimes an old man or woman passing by, would bluntly ask, "Why don't you have children?" I would always respond appropriately, but it was becoming increasingly unpleasant. One day, after finishing the morning's harvest and drinking water on the porch, my mother-in-law called me. "Hey, Emily. How's your night life?" Huh? I nearly spit out my water at her sudden, baffling question. "It's strange that you haven't had kids after so many years. Aren't you satisfying, Stephen?" My mother-in-law's outrageous words left me stunned. Flustered, I said, "What are you talking about? Please stop. This isn't something people normally discuss," and forcefully ended the conversation. Even then, my mother-in-law insisted, "It's important," but I ignored her and stormed out of the room. I always thought this village held old-fashioned values, but this was too much. To ask so openly about our marital life was disturbing. Having left the house, I decided to kill time by walking to the square. I saw a figure ahead. Maybe a neighbor. I tensed up for a moment. I thought she might bring up the topic of children again. But when I saw the face, I was relieved. It was a woman named Sarah who lived nearby. Sarah smiled shyly. I smiled back. Sarah was the only person in this village who never asked me intrusive questions. She was 10 years younger than me, so about 20 now. Sarah wasn't originally from this village. Her parents died in an accident, and she was taken in by her grandmother, who lived here. This happened just before I married into the family. After graduating from a nearby high school, she now helped her grandmother with the orchard. We occasionally crossed paths like this, but Sarah was quiet and didn't talk much, so we rarely conversed. She didn't hang out with others as well, so the villagers considered her an oddball. I used to find Sarah's lack of engagement a bit disappointing. But now, I was very grateful for her presence, as she never asked intrusive questions. Though my mother-in-law's words had upset me, Sarah's presence felt purifying. However, this didn't solve the problem. My in-laws and nearby relatives continued saying similar things. Be more proactive with your husband, or you need to take the lead, they would say endlessly. My mother-in-law even started saying more disturbing things. Last night's dinner was all vegetables. You should add more meat. Maybe some garlic to boost Stephen's energy. How did she even know what we had for dinner? Her nosiness was beyond belief. Unable to take it anymore, I decided to talk to Stephen about everything that had been happening. I'm at my limit. Everyone keeps asking when we'll have kids. Your mother even digs into our marital life. Honestly, it's hard. Stephen, watching TV, didn't take his eyes off the screen and responded indifferently. What are you talking about? Mom and everyone else are just worried about you. It's not worry, it's prying. Doesn't anyone say anything to you? Why would they? Infertility is a woman's responsibility, right? What? I was shocked by Stephen's absurd words. I couldn't believe he had such outdated knowledge. I was completely dumbfounded. Infertility isn't just the woman's fault. Sometimes it's a compatibility issue, and sometimes it's the man. What? Me? No way. Stephen said, looking puzzled. He seemed genuinely baffled. I understood that the elderly in the village might have outdated views, but I was surprised Stephen, who was relatively young, thought this way. Anyway, I want children too, so I'm thinking about fertility treatment. We need to find out the cause to take action. I suggested that Stephen and I go to a gynecologist together. As expected, Stephen was reluctant and came up with excuses. He complained loudly, why do I have to go to such a place, but I managed to persuade him. And he agreed under the condition that we go to a hospital a bit further from the village. Later, we went to a hospital in another state and both underwent tests. A few weeks later, we returned to the hospital and the doctor revealed a fact. There were no issues with you, ma'am. The problem is with your husband. He has azoospermia, meaning no sperm is being produced. The moment Stephen heard this, he became furious. What? There's no way it's my fault. Don't be ridiculous. I was shocked by Stephen's sudden outburst. I had never seen him like this before. The doctor, looking perplexed, showed us the paper with the test results. Staring at the paper, Stephen fell silent with a terrifying expression. He was clearly deeply shocked. I felt sorry for him and couldn't say anything. That night, I gently spoke to Stephen. The doctor said that with more detailed tests, they might find the cause and be able to treat it. It's a bit far, but I'll support you. But Stephen, with his head down, didn't respond. He probably never imagined he could be the cause. Feeling sorry for him, I didn't say anything more and left the room quietly. However, I soon realized that my sympathy was a mistake. Stephen's attitude gradually worsened. The harsh diagnosis seemed to have shattered his pride as a man. In an attempt to regain his shattered self-esteem, he became increasingly aggressive. I was the main target of his frustration. He began to criticize me for small things, like being slow with farm work or not cooking well. At first, I thought he couldn't accept the test results and felt sorry for him, so I stayed silent. But as this continued, I started getting angry too. Our arguments increased, with both of us exchanging harsh words. As a result, the atmosphere at home was constantly filled with tension. Naturally, there was no intimacy, so we couldn't have children. Moreover, there was no way he would agree to go to the hospital for treatment. To make matters worse, the villagers still thought our infertility was my fault. The situation, where I was the one blamed, didn't change. Even though I wanted to tell my in-laws the truth, Stephen glared at me with icy eyes and said, "Don't tell anyone." I was terrified just thinking about what might happen if I revealed the truth, and I couldn't muster the courage to go through with it. Besides, I wasn't even sure if anyone would believe me. Everyone's mindset was so outdated. The prevailing belief was that infertility was the woman's fault. That's probably why Stephen got so angry when he was pointed out as the cause. Living like this, I started to think I couldn't take it anymore. I understood that he was in shock, but this was pure misdirected anger, and I felt like a punching bag. Maybe it's better if we separate. I began to seriously consider this. 6 months passed, and Stephen's bitterness continued. By then, I was determined to get a divorce. But the problem was the village's old-fashioned views. There was a stigma that divorce was disgraceful. I had even heard rumors of a wife who asked for a divorce being verbally abused by her husband. With that in mind, I knew it wouldn't be easy to get his agreement. So I decided to leave a signed divorce paper and flee the village. It seemed drastic, but I was that desperate. I started preparing in secret so Stephen wouldn't notice. Then, the next month, came a day when Stephen was scheduled to go outside the village to ship crops. It was the perfect chance. But as I was packing, the front door opened. What? There stood Stephen, who was supposed to be out. His eyes narrowed, and he shouted, "Where are you going?" When I remained silent, Stephen glanced at the divorce papers on the table. "You were planning to divorce me? Don't be ridiculous. If people find out my wife left me, it'll be humiliating. Don't disgrace me." His reaction was just as I had expected. After a tirade of insults, he warned, "If you ever think of escaping again, you know what will happen." He glared at me with sharp eyes. My plan had failed. I was in despair. But how did he find out? I thought I had acted quietly enough. Since then, Stephen's treatment of me grew even worse. He would complain about everything, from my cleaning to just seeing my face, and any backtalk would result in a huge outburst. "You're the worst kind of woman, trying to run away from me. The guardian sees everything. Your misdeeds will be revealed." That became Stephen's favorite phrase. I began to resent the guardian statue that everyone in the village talked about. I had thought it was just a superstition, but could that statue really be watching me? It was hard to believe that anyone trying to escape from this village would be punished. However, the fact that my whereabouts and actions were always pinpointed was undeniable. I became thoroughly frightened. Gradually, a sense of resignation started to take over. Time passed, and I was about to turn 35. One day, Sarah, who lived nearby, came to visit. "This is unusual. What's up?" Sarah and I had started to talk more when we saw each other. Unlike the gossiping villagers who eyed me suspiciously, Sarah never pried and always treated me kindly. "Emily, there's something I really need to tell you." Seeing the unusually serious look on Sarah's face, I was taken aback. I led her into the house and offered her a cup of coffee. Sarah glanced around nervously. Then she gestured for me to follow her without making a sound. We went into a rarely used room that now served as storage. "What? What's going on?" Following her without knowing why, I asked curiously. Sarah, looking relieved, whispered, "We should be safe here." Then, as if a dam had burst, she started talking. "I'm at my limit, this village, the truth is." What she told me was shocking. It was the horrifying reality of this village. In the following months, Sarah and I secretly met several times. Ever since learning the truth about the village, we had been trying to figure out a way to escape. What Sarah revealed was staggering. Hearing such a story made me even more desperate to leave. However, we had to act cautiously. If our plan was discovered, it would be over. Though it took time, we finally set an execution date. It was this Sunday. There was a village-wide gathering for a festival honoring the guardian, a rare event that happened once every few years. With all the relatives and villagers gathered in one place, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Sarah and I meticulously planned every detail. We were ready. Now, we just needed to put the plan into action. The gathering was to be held at night. The venue was the village's only inn. The building was old, but it had a large capacity, enough to accommodate most of the villagers. As I had done a few years ago, I headed there around noon to help with preparations. My in-laws were already there, so I greeted them, "Good morning." But after a brief glance at me, they disappeared somewhere else. They must be busy, I thought. So, I went ahead and started helping with the food preparations. But it wasn't just my in-laws, other relatives ignored me too, responding with indifference or outright ignoring my questions. Did I do something wrong? Confused, time passed, and night fell. Eventually, relatives and other villagers arrived. Among them was Stephen. But his attitude was the same. He ignored me too. I felt like a ghost. Confused and filled with growing anxiety and frustration. I pretended to go to the restroom and decided to secretly listen to their conversations. What I heard was horrifying. Emily never had children. At her age, it's impossible now. Having an infertile wife is bad luck. We'll be cursed by the guardian. My mother-in-law said disdainfully. Stephen, already drunk and flushed, nodded. Yeah, talking to such an unlucky person might curse us too. It's better if everyone ignores her. Of course. I told the villagers last night. I warned them that anyone who talks to Emily would be cursed by the guardian. My father-in-law added, laughing. Hearing their words, I trembled with rage. Unforgivable. It wasn't my fault that we couldn't have children. And to call me a bad omen, ignoring my very existence. How could grown adults act this way? This village is truly twisted. We should execute our plan as soon as possible. We intended to escape from this village. But escaping alone won't satisfy me. I need to find a way to get back at them. I steeled myself for what was to come. Soon, Sarah poked her head into the venue. It was perfect timing. Without exchanging words, we nodded at each other. Then I turned off the lights in the venue. As the room went dark, I heard people asking, "What happened? Is it a power outage?" Using the commotion to our advantage, Sarah started working on the computer in the corner of the room. Today, a computer, projector, and screen were set up for an event that would look back on the history of the Guardian and the village. We decided to use this setup for our plan. After a while, an image appeared on the screen. What the hell is this? Stephen screamed. My in-laws, relatives, and other villagers were all buzzing in confusion as they looked at the screen. Who did this? Was it Emily? Where is she? Stephen, in a frenzy, started shouting, so me and Sarah decided to make our exit. We quietly slipped out of the venue and met up outside. About 3 minutes after we escaped, my phone started buzzing repeatedly. It was Stephen, calling over and over. Emily. What have you done? He shouted in a distressed voice right from the start. I chuckled. Why are you panicking? It's the truth, isn't it? I just informed everyone about the facts since they seemed to be under some misconceptions. What was displayed on the projector screen was the test result from the gynecologist from a few years ago. It was the diagnosis showing that Stephen had azoospermia. The large, clearly visible words on the screen were enough to shock everyone at the venue. Stephen was in a state of panic, having his well-kept secret revealed. He was so distraught that he kept shouting incoherently. Annoyed by the noise, I quickly hung up the phone. Even as my phone continued to vibrate with his calls, I ignored it. Sarah, watching the situation, looked at me worriedly. Are you okay? She asked. It's going as expected. But we need to give them another push, I replied. The pain I suffered couldn't be resolved this easily. Sarah and I headed back to the venue. When we peeked inside, it was utter chaos. Is this true? Are you really infertile? Stephen, how could this be? Everyone was confronting Stephen. Stephen was pale and kept making excuses, sweating profusely as he claimed, "This is a lie, and it's Emily's scheme." The villagers, who had believed that our inability to have children was my fault, were in shock. But the truth was different. At the time of the test, there was no reason to believe that I was infertile. The reason we couldn't have children was because of Stephen's azoospermia. Yet, without revealing the truth, I was blamed for it. I was scorned for not having children, and my existence was ignored. The countless insults and the painful days that followed were unbearable. I could never forgive them. Sarah and I entered the buzzing venue. "Emily. What are you doing?" Stephen shouted angrily when he saw me. "Stop this nonsense. You'll be cursed by the guardian and face terrible consequences." His words snapped something in me. The guardian? It's just a surveillance camera spying on us. It's disgusting. As I said that, the room fell silent. Stephen, my in-laws, and the villagers turned pale, realizing I had hit the mark. Yes, the guardian wasn't a protector at all. Actually, surveillance cameras were hidden inside the guardian statues. They were placed in stone structures around the village. And even inside plush toys modeled after the guardians that were displayed in the living room. In a room at the community center, board elders monitored these cameras, watching the actions of outsiders. That's why my escape plans were always discovered. Sarah had revealed this to me that day. It was about 10 years ago. When Sarah was taken in by her grandmother in the village, she had just lost her parents and felt lonely. One day, she secretly followed her grandmother to work out of loneliness. Her grandmother went to the community center. There, her grandmother and other elders watched the villagers through surveillance cameras while chatting. This was when Sarah learned about the secret of the guardian cameras, a tradition passed down in the village. The shock gave Sarah a new understanding of the village's atmosphere. The reason rumors spread so quickly was because of this. She already hated being gossiped about through casual chatter. But being monitored by cameras while walking around or even inside her home was too much. Sarah despised the village's tendency to invade others' privacy. So, she lived her life trying to avoid participating in gossip. Because of this, the villagers started to criticize her as an oddball for not joining in the gossip. Though she grew tired of the village, she had no other place to go and no family to rely on. She endured living there. But as she approached 25, her grandmother started telling her to have an arranged marriage. She was pressured to marry an elderly widower living on the village outskirts. With her grandmother insisting she needed to have children quickly to avoid infertility like me. Naturally, Sarah refused such unreasonable demands. But her grandmother began threatening her with the guardian's curse. When she felt she couldn't take it anymore, she thought I might help her. Having seen how I suffered from rumors, she proposed we escape the village together. On that day, Sarah didn't talk in the living room because she spotted a guardian plushie. I hadn't noticed it. I thought it was just a common plushie seen all over the village. But it had a camera inside. Naturally, Stephen must have installed it. It was meant to monitor my actions. That's why my movements were always known. When I tried to escape and even when my mother-in-law guessed our dinner, it was all because they were watching through the cameras. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Instinctively, I knew staying in this village was dangerous. I had to act on Sarah's suggestion and escape this village as soon as possible. We made a plan together. But would it be enough to just escape? I couldn't rest without avenging the years of mistreatment. That's what I thought. First, I needed to clear my name. And then, Sarah. Did you tell them? Traitor. Her grandmother, who had raised her, shouted angrily. But Sarah glared back at her. I appreciate that you took me in when I had no family, but I can't stand living like this. I hate spying on people's lives and spreading rumors and gossip. How dare you? Her grandmother and the villagers began to clamor. To silence them, I decided to deliver the final blow. I manipulated the computer to project new images onto the screen. As the images appeared, everyone was shocked. Stephen caught in compromising positions with a young woman from the village. My mother-in-law secretly adding mop water to the coffee served at village meetings. My father-in-law placing his hands on a married woman's shoulders and waist. Sarah's grandmother stealing vegetables from someone's garden. The screen displayed numerous scenes of almost every villager doing something shameful. Everyone in the room was speechless. Stephen yelled. "When did you take these pictures? How had we captured such compromising photos of everyone?" Sarah had explained it. It was impossible for all the villagers to be genuinely good people. Knowing where the cameras were, they would commit their misdeeds in the blind spots. We focused on those blind spots, the areas the guardian statues and plushies couldn't see. We placed our own small cameras, purchased online, in strategic locations. And then, the misdeeds started pouring out. Villagers, thinking they were unseen, acted with impunity in those blind spots. This was how they maintained the illusion of being good people. It was laughable. We found and saved decisive moments from the camera footage. Then, we exposed those images for everyone to see. An eye for an eye. Since my privacy was invaded, I returned the favor. Now they could see how disgraceful their actions were. The villagers, silenced by my explanation, looked ashamed. "You all claim to be good people, but you're just a bunch of hypocrites. You've done despicable things while enjoying watching outsiders' actions. Enough of this nonsense. I won't stay in this outdated village for another second." I shouted loudly and thrust the divorce papers in front of Stephen. Stunned, he stood there, mouth agape. My in-laws and the villagers were equally shocked. They never expected me to fight back. Sure, there were times when I almost gave up. But with Sarah as my ally, I found a way out and couldn't just sit back and take it anymore. I quietly looked down at them, stunned and speechless. "Goodbye, you pathetic people. Goodbye." Sarah glared at the villagers with contempt. Without looking back, we left the venue. Outside, we grabbed the 2 suitcases we had hidden in the shed. Everything we needed to live was packed inside. I had already left the divorce papers at the house, so all we had to do now was leave the village. As we walked, I suddenly stopped at a certain point. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, puzzled. "I need to do this," I said, grabbing a farming hoe that was leaning against a house. I headed to the village square and swung the hoe with all my might. A tremendous noise echoed as the guardian statue shattered. Of course, the surveillance camera inside was also smashed to pieces. "Emily, you're amazing," Sarah said. "Leaving these things around would do no good." Oh, that felt great. We laughed together. Then, we went around the village, destroying all the small guardian statues. We had already thrown away the plushies inside the house. It was terrifying to think that someone had come up with such an idea. The guardian statues were originally created to scare misbehaving children into behaving. The idea that the guardian would punish bad behavior seemed to work. But over time, it shifted from disciplining children to punishing people who didn't fit the village's mold. This targeted primarily people like me, who came from outside the village. And those like Sarah, who didn't conform to village norms. At first, it was just idle gossip, picking on people who didn't align with the villagers' ideals. It started as a way to pass the time with casual conversation. But times changed, and gossip evolved into surveillance with cameras capable of real-time monitoring. In this closed-off village, using the superstition of the guardian to justify surveillance became the norm. Exposing people's privacy was bad enough, but refusing to update their outdated mindset was even worse. The village's toxic environment eventually corroded the hearts of its residents. I realized that humans were far more terrifying than any curse or punishment. I had no intention of staying in such a place any longer. Without looking back, we left the decaying, backward village. Later, we heard through the grapevine that the village began to fall apart. The exposure of everyone's misdeeds caused internal strife. After ugly conflicts, the villagers split. Communication broke down completely. This impacted their farming. Without proper coordination, mistakes were frequent. Blame was passed around, worsening the situation. Naturally, the condition of the crops declined, and the agricultural cooperative complained. The village's products was no longer accepted. Naturally, no money was coming in. As a result, almost everyone in the village fell into poverty. As for Stephen, I managed to finalize the divorce. Worried that he wouldn't submit the papers, I consulted a lawyer after leaving the village. The lawyer confirmed that Stephen had filed the divorce papers. He readily agreed to the divorce because he wanted to remarry quickly. His new partner was the woman he had been having an affair with, who lived on the outskirts of the village. But with the village facing a food shortage, Stephen's household was also struggling to find enough to eat. Apparently, that woman also ran away. My in-laws, lacking money, are now living in constant arguments. No matter how miserable their lives have become, I feel no sympathy for them. I never want to be involved with them or even think about them again. As for us, we're now living peacefully in a new place. However, the journey to get here was challenging. Sarah had no family, and my parents' house was already home to my brother and his wife, so we couldn't impose on them. We had no one to rely on after leaving the village. So, we secretly started looking for jobs before we left. Since there were surveillance cameras, we couldn't move around too openly. We held our meetings in the shed, where there were no cameras, and planned everything on the computer. This took time, but after numerous remote interviews, we finally found jobs. My previous experience in office work before marriage proved helpful. Even though it was a contract position, it didn't matter. We also found a place to live. It was a small apartment that didn't require a guarantor, but it was far better than the village environment. Sarah, having only farming experience, struggled to find a job, so she lived with me in my apartment while continuing her search. Soon after we left the village, Sarah also secured an office job. Being in her 20s helped, as she was hired despite her lack of experience. Eventually, my hard work paid off, and I was promoted to a full-time position. With a higher salary, we moved from a small apartment to a decent-sized apartment. Along with this, Sarah also became independent. She found an apartment in the neighborhood. Naturally, I became her guarantor. Now, we both have friends at work and in our neighborhood, and we enjoy our daily lives. Leaving the village was the best decision we ever made. At one point, I lost my husband, my home, and my job, but I realized that with courage, we can start our life over again. I want to tell my past self. Never give up. Because I didn't lose hope and took action, I am who I am today.